So we are continuing the reading of chapter 10 in Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology. Chapter 10 is entitled Thresholds of the Neolithic, and we are now on section 3, the Great Diffusion. I'm going to change my glasses in order to do this. This is the fun part, watching me change my glasses. The Great Diffusion. Huizinga, in his highly suggestive study of the play element in culture, Homo Ludens, points out that the Dutch and German words for duty, plicht and pflicht, are related etymologically to our English play, the words being derived from a common root. English pledge, too, is of this context, as well as the verb plight, meaning to put under a pledge, to engage, as in to plight troth, a plighted bride. We may recall Huizinga's reference to the Japanese play language or polite language, asobasi kotoba, where it is not said that you arrive in Tokyo, but that you play arrival. Not that I hear your father is dead, but that I hear your father has played dying. The play concept, as such, is of a higher order than seriousness. Huizinga declares, for seriousness seeks to exclude play, whereas play can very well include seriousness. The royal tombs of Ur illustrate the capacity and spirit of the world's first aristocracy for play, pledging in play and then playing out the pledge. And it was in their utterly wonderful nerve for this particular game that the world was lifted from savagery to civilization. In such a performance of the question of belief is of secondary moment and effect. The principle is that of the mask, the dance, the pageant, the motion pattern through the form of which a new power for life is evoked. An image is conceived, a supernormal image, surpassing in scope the requirements of food, clothing, shelter, sex, and a pleasant hobby for one's leisure time. Nerve is required to move into such a game and to play out the fraction of one's part in the picture. But then, behold, a transformation of life, an increment such as before had not been even imagined, and therewith a new horizon, both for man and for his gods. It was in the marvelous talent of the Sumerians for their extremely demanding divine play that civilization was born as a function of an aristocracy of spirit. And it was continued as such in many parts of the world up to a very recent date. Now, as Sir Leonard Woolley has already shown, the effigies of servants at their tasks in certain Egyptian tombs indicate that at one time the courts of the Nile too went with their kings into the underworld. Likewise, in the royal tombs of ancient China, ceramic effigies have been found. In fact, in China, the practice of human sacrifice at royal entombments persisted until well into the 12th century AD. And in the neighboring island empire of Japan, an impressive instance of the custom of voluntary dead following, Jinchu, loyalty, came to the notice of the world as late as 1912, when the general Count Nogi, the hero of Port Arthur, put himself to death at the precise hour of the burial of his Mikado, Meiji Tenno, and the Countess Nogi then killed herself to accompany her spouse. It is clear from the evidence that the ritual of dead following was generally honored social and religious practice, not only in the cities of the Near East, where the epochal transition was made from savagery to civilization, but also wherever the earliest carriers of the new game of destiny settled in their astonishingly broad and rapid conquest of new fields. The diffusion of their influence can be readily traced in the four directions, or rather to the points between, somewhat as follows. The southwestward diffusion. Already, we have heard something of the early diffusion of this high culture to the Sudan. Far to the south, in the area marked by the great stone temple ruins of Zimbabwe, in South Rhodesian Matabeleland, ritual regicide appears to have been practiced until as late as 1810. The stars and a sacred oracle were consulted by the priests every 4 years, and without fail, the verdict would be death for the king. The custom there was that the king's first wife, who had assisted him with the making of the sacred first fire of his reign, should strangle him with a cord made of the foot sinew of a bull. The night should be a night of the new moon. The corpse should be taken by the priests that night to a hut on the summit of a mountain and there placed on a platform, beneath which a great leathern sack should be hung. The first day the entrails of the king were removed and tossed into the sack. The second, the body was stuffed with herbs and leaves and sewn up again. On the third day, the skull was opened from behind and its contents were emptied into the sack. The fourth day, the corpse was lashed in a crouch position, swathed with cloth in such a way that the toe and fingertips with their nails should protrude, and then wrapped in the fresh hide of a jet-black bull with a white mark on its forehead. Every night for a full year, a priest would open the bull hide and massage the mummy in such a way that its liquid and maggots, as well as toe and fingernails, should drop into the sack. And when this year was accomplished, once again, on a night of the new moon, the favorite wife of the king, not she who had strangled him, but another, was compelled to submit to the removal of her clothing piece by piece, after which she was strangled naked. The body was brought into a cave on the east slope of the mountain, the king's body into one on the west. And when the king had been immured, the dead queen was clothed and likewise immured. The most elaborate ceremonies, however, were reserved for the transportation of the sack from the charnel hut on top of the mountain to a holy cave on its side. 3 people were slain as sacrifices, and the sack was sealed within the cave, with a hollow reed leading from the chamber to the outer world. A priest watched this reed until one day the king's soul emerged from it in the form of a worm, beetle, lizard, snake, or some other small dragon. Whereupon the reed was removed, the hole was sealed, and offerings were made that should be annually renewed. In all of our mappings of historical culture movements in Africa, Frobenius writes, no distribution is repeated more frequently than that of a broad plain down the east coast from the Nile to the Zambesi, that is to say, running in a north to south direction and lying close to the Eritrean shore, and then 2 tongues extending westward from this belt across the continent, the one in the north reaching as far as to Senegal. These 2 transverse areas reveal divergencies which, however, are by far neither as numerous nor as important as the signs of inner accord and unity. And elsewhere he writes, the fragments of mythology and ritual that have come to light in Southeast Africa, in the nuclear zone of the southern part of the Eritrean sphere, compel us to reconstruct an image that resembles that of the Sumerian and the Indian Dravidian lore of life and the gods as closely as one egg resembles another. The moon god imaged as a great bull, his wife the planet Venus. The goddess offers her life for her spouse, and everywhere this goddess, as the morning star, is the goddess of war. As evening star, a goddess of illicit love, and a universal mother besides. In all three zones, Africa, Dravidian India, and Sumer, the drama of the astral sky is the model and very destiny of all life. And when projected as such upon earth, gave rise to what may have been the very earliest form and concept of the state, namely that of a sacred cosmic priestly image. It is too bold given these circumstances. Is it too bold given these circumstances to speak of a great Eritrean culture zone, which in ancient times comprised the shores of the Indian Ocean? We can regard this great Eritrean area as the first zone of diffusion of the mythology of our mythogenetic Fertile Crescent. For a basal Neolithic culture stratum has been identified as early as about 4500 BC in the Nile Valley, and a high Neolithic about 4000. Furthermore, there is now dependable C14 evidence that something of the Neolithic had reached northern Rhodesia as early as circa 4000 BC. While the arts of the Bronze and Iron Ages surely were established in Sudanese Napata by, respectively, circa 750 to 744 and circa 397 to 362 BC. The chief Egyptian sites of the basal stratum are on the left bank of the Nile, at Merimdi, in the Delta region, and at Fayum, somewhat farther south, as well as on the right bank, about 200 miles up the river at Tassa. The assemblages differ slightly among themselves, but in their culture level are about equivalent. The characteristic features being a rough black pottery, excellent basketry, spindle whorls for the fashioning of linen, pallets for cosmetics, burial in a contracted posture at Tassa, or as in sleep, facing east, Merimdi, bone ivory, and at Fayum, ostrich shell beads, boar's tusk, and tiny stone ask, celt, amulets. At Merimdi, wheat stored in silos, and a barnyard stock of swine, cattle, sheep, and goats. C14 dates for Fayum range circa 4440 to 4100 BC. Merimdi and Fayum, owing to an encroachment of the desert, were abandoned toward the close of this period, while at Tassa, a new racial stock appeared with a high Neolithic style of culture, the so-called Badarian. A beautiful red to brown pottery shaped and fired with a skill never excelled in the Nile Valley. Clay and ivory female figurines, the first in Egypt, pottery models of boats, and the first signs of copper give the clue to the level of this culture. In the hunt, the Badarians used the boomerang, and their racial traits suggest Frobenius's great Eritrean zone. Cattle and sheep, as though deified, were sometimes given ceremonial burial, and human remains faced west, not east, toward the land of the setting, not the rising sun. No bones of the pig have been discovered among their remains, and this may signal the commencement of a tradition of abstination from the flesh of swine. An association of the pig with some despised alien or socially inferior group, or with a mythology of the underworld, would suffice to account for such an avoidance, which in any case cannot possibly have been rationalized in the usual modernist way as a prophylaxis against a possible case of trichinosis. The boar's tooth, as we have just seen, was a fetish of the Merimdi of the Delta, while in contrast the sacred beasts of the Badarians of the Upper Nile were the bull and ram. A second high Neolithic stratum overlies the Badarian, the Amratian, where 5 new types of pottery appear, decorated with figures and geometrical designs that do not have the elegance, formal beauty, or mathematical regularity of those of Mesopotamia, but on the other hand are extremely interesting for their obvious derivation from the Capsian art style of North Africa and eastern Spain. The human forms, furthermore, show that the manner of dress had not changed. The men still wore decorated penis sheaths and were otherwise stark naked, with grass sandals with feathers in their hair. The women wore linen aprons and frequently shaved their heads to wear wigs. The physical type was about that of the Capsians, 5 feet 3 inches tall, slender, slightly built, with long, small skull, small features, and straight hair. The bodies were tattooed. Figures of clay and ivory, copper sometimes used now for small tools, papyrus bundle boats, a number of types of arrowhead, and many elegant stone blades characterize the assemblage. Imports of malachite from Sinai, gold from Nubia, coniferous wood from Syria, and obsidian from Armenia and the Aegean speak for a development of trade, while in the graves we find that dogs were buried with their masters, perhaps as guides to the land of the dead, as well as statuettes of women and servants. But then abruptly something new in the Delta: hieroglyphic writing, the calendar, the mythology of the sun god Horus and resurrected god Osiris, trading fleets sailing to the seas to Crete, Syria and Palestine, flying the signal flags of their nomes, the harpoon flag and the fish flag. There is an elegance in the arts and lifestyle of pre-dynastic and dynastic Egypt completely different from those of the mythogenetic zone of Southwest Asia. Furthermore, in Egypt, the new arts were applied to life in new ways. The mythology was adjusted to a geography in which the fertility of the earth sprang from the Nile, not from the clouds, and to a protected land, a grandiose oasis, unified and held in form with comparative ease, in contrast to the motherland of Southwest Asia, where city was to battle city and then empire for millenniums. But a complete contrast in style does not rule out in any way our recognition of the impact of a new idea, derived by diffusion from an alien land. Nor is the diffusion random, it is selective. The wheel appeared in Sumer about 3200 BC, but not in Egypt until 1400 years later, for the Nile supplied the best possible transportation, and it was not until the light war chariot, maneuverable in battle and drawn by steeds, had been invented that the wheel recommended itself as a valuable addition to the culture of the pharaohs. The date of the introduction of writing, the calendar, and their associated arts to Egypt was circa 2800 BC, and that of the wheel circa 1800 BC. The basic myth of dynastic Egypt was that of the death and resurrection of Osiris, the good king, fair of face, who was born to the earth god Geb and sky goddess Nut. He was born together with his sister wife, the goddess Isis, during the sacred interval of those 5 supplementary days that fell between one Egyptian calendric year of 360 days and the next. He and his sister were the first to plant wheat and barley, to gather fruit from trees, and to cultivate the vine. And before their time, the races of the world had been savage cannibals. But Osiris's evil brother Set, whose sister wife was the goddess Nephthys, was mortally jealous both of his virtue and of his fame, and so stealthily, taking the measure of his good brother's body, he caused a beautifully decorated sarcophagus to be fashioned, and on a certain occasion in the palace, when all were drinking and making merry, had it brought into the room and jestingly promised to give it to the one whom it should fit exactly. All tried, but, like the glass slipper of Cinderella, it fitted but one, And when Osiris, the last, laid himself within it, immediately a company of 72 conspirators, with whom Set had contrived his plot, dashed forward, nailed the lid upon the sarcophagus, soldered it with molten lead, and flung it into the Nile, down which it floated to the sea. Isis, overwhelmed with grief, sheared off her locks, donned mourning, and searched in vain up and down the Nile. But the coffer had been carried by the tide to the coast of Phoenicia, where at Byblos it was cast ashore. A tamarisk immediately grew up around it, enclosing the precious object in its trunk. And the aroma of this tree then was so glorious that the local king and queen, Melkart and Astarte, who were of course a divine king and queen themselves, the local representatives, in fact, of the common mythology of Dumuzi and Inanna, Tammuz and Ishtar, Adonis and Aphrodite, Osiris and Isis, discovering and admiring its beauty, had the tree felled and fashioned into a pillar of their palace. The bereaved and sorrowing Isis, meanwhile wandering over the world in her quest, like Demeter in search of the lost Persephone, came to Byblos, where she learned of the wonderful tree. And placing herself by a well of the city in mourning, veiled and in humble guise, again like Demeter, she spoke to none until there approached the well the handmaidens of the queen, whom she greeted kindly. Braiding their hair, she breathed upon them such a wondrous perfume that when they returned and Astarte saw and smelt the braids, she sent for the stranger, took her into the house, and made her the nurse of her child. The great goddess gave the infant her finger instead of breast to suck, and at night, having placed him in a fire to burn away all that was mortal, flew in the form of a swallow around the pillar, mournfully chirping. But the child's mother, Queen Astarte, happening in upon this scene, shrieked when she spied her little son resting in the flame, and thereby deprived him of the priceless boon. Whereupon Isis, revealing her true nature, begged for the pillar, and removing the sarcophagus, fell upon it with a cry of grief so loud that the queen's child died on the spot. Sorrowing then, the two women placed Osiris's coffer on a boat, and when the goddess Isis was alone with it at sea, she opened the chest, and laying her face on the face of her brother, kissed him and wept. The myth goes on to tell of the blessed boat's arrival in the marshes of the delta, and how Set, one night hunting the boar by the light of the full moon, discovered the sarcophagus and tore the body into 14 pieces, which he scattered abroad, so that once again the goddess had a difficult task before her. She was assisted this time, however, by her little son Horus, who had the head of a hawk, by the son of her sister Nephthys, little Anubis, who had the head of a jackal, and by Nephthys herself, the sister bride of their wicked brother Set. Anubis, the elder of the two boys, had been conceived one very dark night, we are told, when Osiris mistook Nephthys for Isis, so that by some it is argued that the malice of Set must have been inspired not by the public virtue and good name of the noble culture hero, but by this domestic inadvertence. The younger, but true son, Horus, on the other hand, had been more fortunately conceived, according to some, when Isis lay upon her dead brother in the boat, or, according to others, as she fluttered about the palace pillar in the form of a bird. The four bereaved and searching divinities, the two mothers and their two sons, were joined by a fifth, the moon god, Thoth, who appears sometimes in the form of an ibis-headed scribe, at other times in the form of a baboon. And together they found all of Osiris save his genital member, which had been swallowed by a fish. They tightly swathed the broken body in linen bandages, and when they performed over it the rites that thereafter were to be continued in Egypt in the ceremonial burial of kings, Isis fanned the corpse with her wings, and Osiris revived to become the ruler of the dead. He now sits majestically in the underworld, in the Hall of the Two Truths, assisted by 42 assessors, one from each of the principal districts of Egypt. And there he judges the souls of the dead. These confess before him, and when their hearts have been weighed in a balance against a feather, receive according to their lives the reward of virtue and the punishment of sin. The myth is clearly of the family of Damuzi Apsu and Inanna. However, the symbolic animal involved, at least in this version of the Great Adventure, was not the moon bull, as in the Mesopotamian myths and rites of the royal tombs of Ur, but the pig, as in the Greek rituals of Persephone and Melanesian of Hanueli. For Set, as we have just seen, was hunting the boar on the night of the full moon, when he found and dismembered the body of Osiris. Comparably, according to Ovid, the young Adonis, beloved of Venus Aphrodite, the classical counterpart of both Isis and Inanna, was killed by a wild boar when out hunting. And the Phrygian ever-dying and resurrected divinity Attis, following one version of his legend, was likewise gored by a boar, but according to another, was himself a pig. Apparently, therefore, we have here the evidence either of two periods or of two provinces of the same essential myth, one associating the bull, but the other a boar, with the force of the abyss. Next time we'll continue with section 3.